Camp Ruston, Louisiana, March 1943. The morning sun broke over the newly constructed prisoner of war compound, where hundreds of captured soldiers from the German armed forces waited in long lines outside a mess hall that smelled of fresh lumber and boiling grits. The air hung thick with humidity, a wet heaviness that clung to skin and uniforms, so different from the arid desert heat these men had known in North Africa. Pine trees surrounded the compound, their scent mixing with the aromas drifting from the kitchen, and mockingbirds sang in the branches as if this were just another peaceful morning in rural Louisiana, rather than a gathering place for former enemies. They had crossed an ocean as conquerors and now stood on American soil as the defeated, uncertain of what awaited them behind those kitchen doors. Their journey had been long and disorienting. After capture in Tunisia, they had been held in temporary camps in North Africa, then loaded onto transport ships for the Atlantic crossing. Many had been seasick during the voyage, cramped in holds below deck with minimal rations and poor ventilation. They had expected to be taken to England, perhaps, or directly to prison camps in the northern United States. Instead, they had been transported by train deep into the American South, through landscapes of cotton fields and small towns, arriving finally at this compound carved out of pine forests. Most expected the worst treatment imaginable, perhaps starvation rations or systematic abuse, because that was what they had been told would happen if they ever fell into enemy hands. The propaganda they had been fed spoke of American brutality, of prisoners worked to death or simply eliminated. Some of the younger soldiers had been terrified during the crossing, certain they were being transported to their doom. The older veterans tried to maintain calm, but even they felt the gnawing uncertainty of men whose fate was entirely in the hands of those they had fought against. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these men could not have known, standing in those early morning chow lines, was that they were about to witness something that would fundamentally challenge everything they believed about race, humanity, and the nation that had captured them. And it would all begin with a meal served by a man who, under the laws of that very state, was not permitted to sit at the same table as them. Sergeant James Whitfield Carter stood at his station in the mess hall kitchen, sweat already beading on his forehead, despite the early hour. At 32 years old, he had been cooking in the United States Army for nearly 4 years, ever since he enlisted in 1939 from his hometown of Birmingham, Alabama. He was a big man, 6 feet 2 inches tall with broad shoulders, built from years of hauling supplies and working over industrial stoves. His hands, scarred from a decade of kitchen work before the military, moved with practiced efficiency as he oversaw the morning meal preparation. Carter had grown up in the shadow of Jim Crow, understanding from childhood that there were places he could not go, water fountains he could not drink from, and restaurants where he could not eat despite his own culinary skills. His mother, Sarah Carter, had been a domestic worker for a wealthy white family in the Mountain Brook area of Birmingham, leaving home before dawn 6 days a week to cook, clean, and care for children who were not her own. She would return home exhausted each evening, her feet swollen, to care for her own family in a shotgun house in the colored neighborhood of Smithfield. His father, Robert Carter, had worked in the steel mills that dominated Birmingham's economy, one of thousands of colored men who performed the hottest, most dangerous jobs in the foundries. The work paid better than field labor, but came with constant risk. Robert had been a strong man, proud of his ability to provide for his family, despite the limitations placed on colored workers. When James was 15, his father had been caught in an accident involving a ladle of molten steel. The mill provided no compensation beyond a small burial payment. Sarah had been forced to work even longer hours to keep the family afloat, and young James had taken whatever jobs he could find after school. Cooking had been his escape, his art, and eventually his livelihood. He had started working in the kitchen of a colored restaurant when he was 16, washing dishes and peeling vegetables. The head cook, an older man named Samuel Washington, who had trained in the kitchens of Tuskegee Institute, recognized something in the young man and began teaching him the craft. Over the next decade, Carter learned not just how to cook, but how to transform simple ingredients into memorable meals. He learned the chemistry of baking, the art of seasoning, the importance of timing and temperature. By the time he was in his mid-20s, Carter had earned a reputation throughout Birmingham's coloured community as an exceptional cook. He worked in several establishments, always making do with whatever ingredients and equipment were available, always producing food that made customers return. But he also understood that his opportunities were fundamentally limited. He could never work in the finest restaurants downtown, never train under the celebrated white chefs, never advance beyond serving his own community, no matter how skilled he became. When the military had come calling, Carter had seen an opportunity. Perhaps in uniform he had thought, things might be different. Perhaps serving his country would earn him the respect that his skin color had denied him in civilian life. He had been assigned to the Quartermaster Corps, and for 4 years he had cooked for American soldiers at various posts throughout the South. The irony was never lost on him that he could prepare food for white soldiers, but could not eat alongside them in the mess hall. Now in March of 1943, he found himself cooking for the enemy. Camp Ruston had been designated as one of dozens of prisoner-of-war camps scattered throughout the United States, part of a massive logistics operation to house the growing number of captured soldiers from the German armed forces. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners receive rations equivalent to what American troops ate, a fact that had caused considerable controversy in some quarters. Many Americans wondered why the enemy should eat as well as their own boys fighting overseas. The kitchen at Camp Ruston was a long, rectangular building with industrial ranges, massive pots that could hold 50 gallons, and a serving line that could feed 1,000 men in 2 hours. Carter commanded a staff of 12, including 3 other colored soldiers and 8 white cooks who had been assigned to him based on his rank and experience, though some of them clearly resented taking orders from a Negro sergeant. Private Thomas Burke, a thin young man from South Carolina, had made his feelings known on the first day. "I did not join this man's army to take orders from a colored," Burke had said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Carter had walked up to him slowly, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze that had taken years to perfect, the look that said, "I am going to maintain my dignity no matter what you say or do." "Private Burke," Carter had said in a voice that was quiet but carried throughout the kitchen, "in this kitchen you will follow orders or you will be on report. I do not care what you think about me, but you will respect this uniform and you will respect the stripes on my sleeve. Do we have an understanding?" Burke had looked away first, muttering something under his breath but nodding. They had maintained an uneasy working relationship ever since, though Carter knew the young private would never truly accept him as a superior. The prisoners began arriving at Camp Ruston in batches throughout February and early March of 1943. Most had been captured in North Africa during the final collapse of German forces in Tunisia. They arrived by train, still wearing the remnants of their tropical uniforms, dust from the African desert still clinging to their boots. They had expected to be conquering Egypt and driving toward the oil fields beyond. Instead, they had been overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower, then packed into ships and sent across the Atlantic to a fate unknown. Hauptmann Friedrich Müller was among the first batch of officers to arrive. At 41, he was older than most of the prisoners, a career soldier who had served in the previous conflict before joining the military again when the current war began. He held a degree in engineering from the University of Munich and had commanded a supply battalion, not a combat unit. Müller was tall and lean with graying hair at his temples and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a professorial air. He spoke excellent English, having spent 2 years studying in London before the previous war. Müller had been raised in a Germany that had indoctrinated him with specific beliefs about racial hierarchy. His education had been thorough and systematic, beginning in primary school and continuing through his university years. He had been taught that certain races were inferior, that the Aryan people represented the pinnacle of human achievement, and that other groups, particularly those with darker skin, were lesser beings suited only for manual labor and servitude. These ideas had been presented not as opinions, but as scientific facts, supported by respected academics and reinforced by government policy. As a young man studying engineering in the 1920s, Müller had focused primarily on technical matters and given little thought to political ideology. He had been interested in bridges and buildings, in calculations and designs. But the political atmosphere of Germany had been impossible to ignore. After the previous war's defeat and the economic catastrophes that followed, the nation had been searching for explanations and solutions. The ideologies that emerged offered simple answers to complex problems, and Müller, like millions of others, had found those answers compelling. He had not been a zealot or an enthusiastic supporter of every policy. He had focused on his professional life, on engineering projects and military logistics, but he had accepted the underlying premises of racial ideology without serious examination. When he saw propaganda posters or heard speeches about racial superiority, he simply nodded and moved on, assuming that the authorities knew what they were talking about. It had required no active hatred on his part, merely passive acceptance of the cultural attitudes surrounding him. His time in London before the previous war had been his only extended exposure to a different society. He had found the British to be organized and efficient, and he had admired their engineering achievements. He had noticed their colonial empire and the way they spoke about various peoples under their control, and it had seemed to confirm that racial hierarchies were simply a natural part of how advanced nations organized themselves. He had not questioned whether such hierarchies were moral or accurate. They simply were, like gravity or mathematics. When Müller and his fellow officers first entered the mess hall at Camp Ruston on that March morning, they did not know what to expect. Some feared they would be starved or given food not fit for animals. Others expected minimal rations, bread and water perhaps. Enough to keep them alive, but nothing more. What they found instead was a serving line, where American soldiers in kitchen whites stood ready to serve them. And the first man they saw, the one clearly in charge based on the sergeant stripes on his sleeve, was a Negro. The reaction among the prisoners was immediate and varied. Some looked confused, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been taught. Others showed visible disgust. A few of the younger soldiers began to laugh, assuming this was some kind of elaborate joke or deliberate humiliation, putting a member of an inferior race in charge of serving them as an insult. Müller watched Carter carefully as the line began to move. He observed how the Negro sergeant directed his staff with quiet efficiency, checking portion sizes, ensuring the food was hot, maintaining order without raising his voice. There was a competence there that surprised him. More than that, there was a dignity in how Carter carried himself, a calm authority that seemed at odds with everything Müller had been taught about racial capabilities. The meal that morning was substantial by any standard. Scrambled eggs made from real eggs, not powder, thick slices of bacon, crispy and fragrant, hash browns with onions, fresh bread with butter and jam, hot coffee as much as they wanted, oranges for vitamin C. The portions were generous, far more than many of the prisoners had eaten in months, while serving in North Africa, where supply lines had been constantly disrupted. Carter served each prisoner personally, making eye contact, ensuring each man received a full portion. He did not smile or speak except to ask if they wanted coffee, but he treated each prisoner with basic human courtesy. When one young soldier's hand shook and he nearly dropped his tray, Carter steadied it without comment and continued serving. Private Ernst Köhler, a 19-year-old from Hamburg who had been conscripted 2 years earlier, stared at his tray as he sat down at one of the long tables. He had not seen food like this since leaving home. In North Africa, their rations had been increasingly meager as the supply situation deteriorated. Canned meat that tasted metallic, hard bread that had to be soaked in water to chew, ersatz coffee made from roasted grains that bore little resemblance to actual coffee. There had been days when the rations did not arrive at all, when they subsisted on whatever could be scrounged or traded from local populations. Köhler remembered the growing desperation of those final weeks in Tunisia. The supply ships had been intercepted or could not make it through at all. Ammunition ran low, then fuel, then food. Men began to look gaunt, their uniforms hanging loose on frames that had shed weight they could not afford to lose. Some talked of surrender before it became official, weighing the risk of captivity against the certainty of slow starvation. And here, served by the enemy, served by a colored man no less, was a breakfast that looked like something from a hotel. The eggs were fluffy and warm, seasoned perfectly. The bacon was thick-cut and crispy, not the thin, fatty strips they had occasionally received in better times. The hash browns had real butter, and the bread was fresh enough that steam rose when he tore it open. There was jam, two kinds, and the coffee actually tasted like coffee. "How can this be?" Köhler said to the man next to him, an older soldier named Hans Brandt. "They feed us like this. And that Negro, he is in charge." Brandt, who at 35 had seen more of the world than young Köhler, shook his head slowly. He had fought in Poland, in France, and finally in Africa. He had seen how wars were won and lost, and he understood that logistics mattered as much as courage. The meal before him told him something important about the nation that had defeated them. A country that could feed its prisoners this well had industrial capacity beyond anything he had imagined. "I do not understand it either," Brandt said quietly. "Everything we were told, everything we learned, how can they put such a man in authority? And more than that, how can they afford to feed us so well when they must be feeding millions of their own soldiers around the world?" Obergefreiter Wilhelm Schneider, sitting across from them, sneered as he poked at his eggs. "It is propaganda," he said. "They are trying to confuse us, to make us doubt. Or perhaps it is meant as an insult, to have an inferior race serve us as if we are even lower. Do not be fooled by this food. It will not last." But it did last. Day after day, 3 times a day, the prisoners lined up and were served meals that exceeded their expectations. Lunch might be roast beef with mashed potatoes and green beans. Dinner could be pork chops with rice and carrots. There was always bread, always coffee, always enough to fill their stomachs. And always Sergeant Carter was there, overseeing the operation with the same quiet competence. What the prisoners did not see was the separate mess hall for colored troops, located on the other side of the camp. They did not see that Sergeant Carter, after serving hundreds of German prisoners, would walk across the compound to eat his own meals in a segregated facility. They did not know that when Carter received leave and traveled into town, he had to sit in the back of buses, could not eat in most restaurants, and had to be careful about which neighborhoods he walked through after dark. The colored mess hall was smaller, older, and less well-equipped than the facility where white soldiers ate. While both served the same basic rations according to regulations, there were subtle differences that accumulated into an unmistakable message about worth and status. The colored facility had fewer windows, older stoves, and tables that had been repaired multiple times. When equipment broke, it was replaced more slowly. When supplies ran short, the colored facility felt the shortage first. Carter ate most of his meals there in silence, sitting with other colored non-commissioned officers who understood without speaking that complaint was futile and dangerous. They discussed their work, their families, the progress of the war, but they rarely spoke directly about the system that constrained them. To do so invited trouble, and they all had too much to lose. On his first leave from Camp Ruston, Carter had taken the bus into Shreveport, hoping to find a decent restaurant and perhaps see a movie. He had his uniform pressed sharp, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He was a sergeant in the United States Army, representing his country even on leave. But when he boarded the bus, the driver had pointed wordlessly to the back, and Carter had walked past rows of empty seats designated for whites to stand in the crowded colored section. In town, he had tried to enter a restaurant, only to be told they did not serve coloreds. At another place, he was directed to a side window, where he could order food to take away but could not sit inside. By the end of the day, exhausted and humiliated despite his best efforts to maintain dignity, he had returned to camp, having spent most of his leave money on a meal eaten standing in an alley. These experiences were so common, so routine, that Carter barely thought of them as noteworthy anymore. They were simply the conditions of his existence, the price of being colored in America. What made Camp Ruston unusual was not that segregation existed, but that his professional competence was recognized despite it. Colonel Harrison might not invite Carter to eat at his table, but he trusted him to run the kitchen that fed the entire camp. It was a small thing, perhaps, but Carter had learned to find meaning in small things. One afternoon in late March, a situation arose that would become a turning point. A new batch of prisoners had arrived, including several officers who were particularly vocal about their displeasure at being served by colored soldiers. Lieutenant Dieter Hoffmann, a 28-year-old from Prussia who came from a family of military tradition, made his feelings known loudly as he entered the mess hall. "This is an outrage," Hoffmann declared in German to the men around him, to be served by an Untermensch, a subhuman. It is a deliberation degradation. I will not eat food touched by such hands. Müller, who was in line behind Hoffmann, felt a flash of anger at the young officer's words, though he was not entirely sure why. Something had been shifting in his thinking over the past few weeks. A slow, uncomfortable questioning of certainties he had held his entire life. He had watched Carter day after day, had observed his professionalism, his skill, the respect his subordinates showed him even when some of them clearly harbored their own prejudices. Lieutenant Müller said quietly in German, I suggest you reconsider your statement. We are prisoners here. We eat what we are given. And we are being fed better than we have any right to expect. Hoffmann turned, his face flushed. You would defend this. You would accept being served by such a person as if it were normal? I accept reality, Hauptmann Müller replied. That man, he gestured toward Carter, wears the rank of sergeant in the United States Army. He commands this kitchen with more efficiency than I saw in many German operations in Africa. What he is does not change what he does. You sound like you have been infected by their propaganda, Hoffmann spat. Next, you will be telling me we should be grateful. Perhaps we should be, Müller said, and the words surprised him even as he said them. We were defeated. We could be treated far worse than this. The exchange had been in German, and Carter did not speak the language, but he had been working with German prisoners long enough to recognize the tone of an argument. He saw the young lieutenant's aggressive body language, saw the way the man looked at him with undisguised contempt. Carter had seen that look many times before, in Alabama, in Mississippi, in every southern state where he had lived or served. He knew hatred when he saw it. Carter continued serving, his face expressionless. He had learned long ago that responding to such contempt only gave it power. Dignity, his mother had taught him, was something no one could take from you if you refused to surrender it. So he served the young lieutenant the same portion as everyone else, made the same brief eye contact, and moved on to the next man. But Private Burke, who was serving vegetables that day, had seen the exchange and understood enough of it. Burke, despite his own prejudices, had developed a grudging respect for Carter's professionalism. No one could question that the sergeant ran the best mess hall Burke had ever worked in. When Burke saw Hoffmann deliberately knock his coffee cup off his tray as he passed, spilling the hot liquid across the serving area, Burke surprised himself by speaking up. Sir, Burke said to Carter, that prisoner did that on purpose. I saw him. Carter glanced at the spilled coffee, then at Hoffmann's retreating back, then at Burke. Their eyes met for a moment, and something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that perhaps respect could be built on shared work rather than shared skin color. Clean it up, Private Burke, Carter said calmly. We have more men to feed. Yes, Sergeant, Burke replied, and for the first time there was no resentment in how he said the rank. As the weeks turned into months, patterns emerged in the camp. The prisoners settled into routines. They worked on various labor details as allowed under the Geneva Convention, maintaining the camp, working in the surrounding forests, helping with agricultural work on nearby farms. They received mail from home, were allowed to send letters, and had access to musical instruments and sports equipment. By all accounts, Camp Ruston was one of the better prisoner of war facilities in the United States. But tensions existed beneath the surface, particularly around matters of race. The prisoners observed the camp's segregation policies with a mixture of confusion and confirmation of their existing beliefs. They saw that colored soldiers lived in separate barracks, ate in separate facilities, and were generally kept apart from white troops. To some, like young Hoffmann, this seemed to confirm what they had been taught about racial hierarchies. Even the Americans understood that races should be kept separate. However, others like Müller began to see contradictions that troubled them. If colored people were truly inferior, why did one command the kitchen with such competence? Why did white soldiers ultimately follow his orders? Why was the food prepared under his supervision consistently excellent? These questions gnawed at assumptions Müller had never thought to question before. In May of 1943, an incident occurred that would become legendary in the camp's history, though the full story would not be widely known until years later. A detail of prisoners had been taken into the nearby town of Ruston to perform some maintenance work on a municipal building. Miller was part of this group, along with about 20 other prisoners and their guards. The work was completed by early afternoon, and the guards decided to stop for lunch before returning to camp. They pulled up to a small restaurant on the main street. The guards went inside first to arrange for meals, and while the prisoners waited outside, Müller observed something that would crystallize all the contradictions that had been building in his mind. A colored family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, approached the restaurant. Müller watched as the father tried to enter, only to be stopped by a white man at the door. There was a brief conversation, the white man pointing to a sign, and then the colored family walked away. The father's shoulders slumped, the children looking confused and hurt. Moments later, the guards emerged and gestured for the prisoners to come inside. The restaurant owner had agreed to serve them, to serve German prisoners, enemy soldiers who had fought against American forces. But that colored family, American citizens, had been turned away. Müller stood frozen for a moment, his mind trying to process what he had just witnessed. He thought of Sergeant Carter, who served him breakfast every morning with quiet professionalism, who could not eat in this restaurant where Müller, a captured enemy soldier, was welcomed. The contradiction was so stark, so absurd, that it shattered something fundamental in his worldview. "Hauptmann, is something wrong?" one of the guards asked, noticing Müller had not moved. Müller looked at the guard, a young corporal from Indiana who seemed like a decent man. "That family," Müller said carefully, his English formal and precise. "They could not eat here." The corporal glanced in the direction the family had gone and shrugged uncomfortably. "That is just how it is down here, sir. The South has different rules about that sort of thing." "But we can eat here," Müller said, not as a question, but as a statement of incomprehensible fact. "Yes, sir, you are in our custody. It is different." "I see," Müller said, though he did not see at all. Or rather, he saw clearly for the first time, and what he saw filled him with a shame he could not fully articulate. When they returned to camp that evening, Müller sought out Carter in the kitchen. The evening meal service had just ended, and Carter was supervising the cleanup. Müller stood at the entrance to the kitchen, waiting to be acknowledged. Carter saw him and walked over, wiping his hands on a towel. "Hauptmann," Carter said with his usual professional courtesy, "can I help you with something?" Was there a problem with the meal? "No, Sergeant," Müller said, and then paused, unsure how to continue. "The meal was excellent as always. I wanted to, I needed to." He stopped again, struggling with words in a language that was not his own, trying to express something he could barely articulate in German. Carter waited patiently, his expression neutral but his eyes alert. He had learned to be cautious around prisoners who sought him out individually. Most had complaints or requests. A few had tried to test his authority in subtle ways. Today, Müller finally continued. "I saw something in town that troubled me greatly. I saw that you, first sergeant in the United States Army, cannot eat in places where I, a prisoner, am welcomed. I saw a family turned away who had done nothing wrong except be born with dark skin. I cannot reconcile this with what I see here, with your competence and authority." Carter's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or wariness. This is the first time, Carter thought to himself, that one of them has said anything like this. "Hauptmann Müller," Carter said carefully, "that is how things are in this part of the country. It is not for me to explain or defend. It simply is." "But it is wrong," Müller said, and the words seemed to burst from him with sudden vehemence. "I was taught that people like you were inferior, that the color of skin determined capability and worth. I believed this because everyone around me said it was true, but you have shown me otherwise every day for months now. And today I saw how your own country treats you, and I realized that I have been living in a kind of madness, believing lies because they were repeated often enough." Carter looked at this German officer, this man who weeks ago would have considered him subhuman, and saw genuine anguish in his face. In that moment, Carter felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Vindication, certainly, that his humanity had been recognized, but also a deep weariness, because one man's realization did not change the system he lived in. "I appreciate your words," Carter said finally, "but understanding comes slowly for some, never for others. I am not sure what you expect me to say." "I expect nothing," Müller replied. I only wanted you to know that you have taught me something important, though I do not think you intended to teach it. You have shown me that what I believed was wrong, and I am grateful for that lesson, even though it fills me with shame for what I once accepted as truth." With that, Müller nodded respectfully and left the kitchen. Carter stood alone for a moment, processing what had just happened. Then he turned back to his work, because there was always work to be done, always meals to prepare, always service to render. Word of Müller's transformation spread quietly among some of the other prisoners, though not all received it well. Hoffman, the young lieutenant who had spilled his coffee in protest, confronted Müller in their barracks one evening. "You have gone soft," Hoffman said, his voice thick with contempt. "You speak of that Negro sergeant as if he were your equal. Have you forgotten everything we were taught?" "No," Müller said quietly. "I have remembered everything I was taught, and I have realized that much of it was lies." "You are a traitor to your race and your nation," Hoffman spat. "Perhaps," Müller said, though his voice was steady. "Or perhaps I am finally becoming the kind of man I should have been all along. A man who judges others by their actions and character, rather than by the color of their skin." The debate that erupted in the prisoner barracks that night reflected larger tensions that existed throughout the camp. Some prisoners, like Köhler and Brandt, found themselves questioning beliefs they had held without examination. Others, like Hoffman and Schneider, doubled down on their convictions, seeing any wavering as weakness or betrayal. But the majority simply continued their daily routines, eating the food served to them, doing their assigned work, and trying not to think too deeply about contradictions that had no easy answers. For most of them, Sergeant Carter was simply the man who made sure they were fed. Whether that made him inferior, equal, or superior was a question they avoided confronting. In June of 1943, something happened that would test everyone's convictions in a way no one anticipated. A severe storm rolled through Louisiana, bringing torrential rains and high winds that caused significant damage to the camp. Several buildings were damaged, including the white soldiers' mess hall, which suffered a partial roof collapse during the height of the storm. For 3 days, while repairs were made to the white mess hall, all American soldiers at the camp, both white and colored, would need to eat in the colored soldiers' mess facility, which had survived the storm intact. This created a logistical problem that quickly became a social crisis. Many white soldiers objected strenuously to eating in the colored facility, seeing it as a degradation of their status. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Harrison, the camp commander, a career officer from Virginia, called a meeting of his senior staff. Harrison was a complex man, a product of his time and place, who held conventional Southern views on race, but who also valued military efficiency above personal preferences. "Gentlemen," Harrison said to the assembled officers and senior non-commissioned officers, "we have a situation. We need to feed approximately 800 white soldiers for the next 3 days while repairs are made to their mess hall. The colored facility can accommodate the numbers, but I am hearing complaints from the men." Captain James Morrison, the camp adjutant, spoke up. "Sir, the men feel that it is inappropriate for them to eat in the colored facility. They are requesting that alternate arrangements be made." "What alternate arrangements?" Harrison asked, his voice sharp. "Should we build a new mess hall in 3 days? Should we serve meals outdoors in this weather? The colored facility is fully functional, the kitchen is adequate, and the food will be the same food they would eat in their own mess hall." "It is not about the food, sir," Morrison said carefully. "It is about the principle of the thing." Before Harrison could respond, Sergeant Carter, who was present as the senior cook in the camp, spoke up. "If I may." "Sir, the issue is that the men do not want to eat where colored soldiers eat. Is that correct?" Morrison looked uncomfortable, but nodded. "That is essentially it. Yes, Sergeant." "Then perhaps," Carter said, his voice calm and measured, "this is an opportunity for education rather than accommodation. These same men have no problem eating food prepared by colored hands. They have no problem with colored soldiers doing their laundry, maintaining their facilities, performing labor that keeps this camp running. The only thing they object to is sitting in the same space." Harrison studied Carter for a long moment. The sergeant had an excellent record, ran the most efficient operation in the camp, and had never caused any trouble despite the difficult position he was in. Harrison was a practical man, and he recognized competence when he saw it. "Sergeant Carter raises a valid point," Harrison said finally. "Gentlemen, for the next 3 days, all soldiers in this camp will eat in the facility that is available and functional. Anyone who objects can go hungry. That is my order. And frankly, if our boys cannot handle eating in the same building where our colored soldiers eat, then I question whether they are tough enough to be in this man's army in the first place." The order stood, and for 3 days, an unprecedented social experiment took place at Camp Ruston. White soldiers sat at tables in the colored mess hall, ate food prepared in the colored kitchen, and existed in a space that had been designated as separate and inferior. Some refused on the first day, and did indeed go hungry, but hunger is a powerful motivator, and by the second day, nearly everyone was falling in line. What happened during those 3 days surprised nearly everyone. The white soldiers discovered that the food was excellent, because Carter and his staff took pride in their work, regardless of who they were feeding. They discovered that the colored soldiers were respectful and gave them space, not seeking confrontation. And some of them began to realize that the separation they had insisted upon had no rational basis beyond tradition and prejudice. The German prisoners observed all of this with great interest. They saw the forced integration, the resistance, and gradually the acceptance. They saw how arbitrary the color line was, how it could be crossed when necessity demanded it. For prisoners like Miller, it confirmed everything he had been thinking. For others like Hoffman, it represented further evidence of American hypocrisy. On the third evening, as the white soldiers ate their final meal in the colored facility, before their own mess hall reopened the next day, an incident occurred that would become one of the most talked-about moments in the camp's history. Private Burke, who had been working in Carter's kitchen for months now, stood up in the middle of the meal and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I got something to say," Burke announced, his South Carolina accent thick and his voice uncertain but determined. His fellow soldiers looked at him with curiosity and some apprehension. "For the past few months," Burke continued, "I have been working under Sergeant Carter in the kitchen. When I first got assigned there, I was angry about it. I did not think a colored man should be giving me orders. I said some things I am not proud of, but I want to say now in front of everyone that Sergeant Carter is the best non-commissioned officer I have ever served under. He runs a tight kitchen, he treats everyone fair, and he makes sure we serve good food to everyone, whether it is our own boys, colored soldiers, or even the enemy prisoners. And if we are honest with ourselves, we have to admit that the color of a man's skin has nothing to do with whether he can do his job well or whether he deserves respect." The mess hall fell silent. Carter, who was supervising from the serving line, stood frozen, uncertain how to respond. No white soldier had ever spoken about him this way publicly, let alone a Southern white soldier who had initially resented his authority. "Private Burke is correct," another voice said, and everyone turned to see Hauptmann Müller standing up. The German officer had been eating with a group of prisoners at a table near the white soldiers. "Sir," Müller said, addressing Burke formally, "I am a prisoner and an enemy, so perhaps my words mean nothing to you. But I want to say that Sergeant Carter has been one of the finest soldiers I have observed during my time here. In my country, I was taught that men like him were inferior. I was wrong, and my country was wrong. I hope that America does not make the same mistakes that my nation made." What followed was even more remarkable. Several other soldiers, both white and colored, stood up and spoke. Some talked about Carter's professionalism. Others talked about how the forced integration of the past 3 days had not been as terrible as they had feared. A few simply said that perhaps it was time to reconsider how things had always been done. Carter listened to all of this with a mixture of emotions he could barely process. Pride, certainly, that his work was being recognized. Hope, perhaps, that things might slowly change. But also caution, because he had seen promising moments before that led nowhere, and he knew that a few kind words did not overturn centuries of systemic racism. When the speeches finally ended and the meal service resumed, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison approached Carter. The two men had maintained a correct but distant relationship throughout Carter's time at the camp. Harrison had never been overtly hostile, but neither had he gone out of his way to support his colored sergeant. "Sergeant Carter," Harrison said quietly so others could not hear. "I owe you an apology. I have allowed certain conditions to exist in this camp that are not consistent with the values we claim to be fighting for. I cannot change everything, and I cannot change the laws of Louisiana or the policies of the Army. But I can make sure that in this camp, competence and character are what matter, not the color of a man's skin. You have my word that I will do better." "Thank you, sir," Carter said, maintaining his professional demeanor, despite the significance of what he had just heard. "I appreciate that more than you know." The repairs to the White Mess Hall were completed, and the segregation of facilities resumed. But something had shifted. Some invisible line had been crossed that could not be fully uncrossed. White soldiers who had eaten in the colored facility for 3 days found it harder to justify why such separation was necessary. Prisoners who had witnessed the entire situation found their own certainties further eroded. In the months that followed, small changes began to occur at Camp Ruston. White and colored soldiers began interacting more freely in certain contexts. Work details became more integrated. While the official policy of segregation remained in place, the rigid enforcement of it began to soften in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible not to notice. Hauptmann Müller became one of Carter's most unlikely advocates. He spent hours talking with other prisoners about his experiences, trying to explain the transformation in his thinking. Some listened and reconsidered their own beliefs. Others dismissed him as weak or corrupted by American propaganda. But the conversations continued, and ideas once accepted without question were now being debated. In September of 1943, Müller approached Carter with a request. Several of the prisoners wanted to learn to cook, and Müller asked if Carter would be willing to teach them. This was unprecedented on multiple levels, prisoners asking to learn from a colored sergeant, seeking his expertise voluntarily rather than being forced to accept it. Carter agreed, and for several weeks a small group of German prisoners learned cooking techniques from the man they had once been taught to consider subhuman. They learned how to prepare American dishes, how to manage kitchen operations, how to maintain food safety standards. But more than that, they learned that knowledge and skill transcended racial boundaries, that a good teacher was a good teacher, regardless of skin color. One evening during these cooking lessons, young Köhler, who had been one of the most diligent students, asked Carter a question that had clearly been weighing on him. "Sergeant, if I may ask, how do you maintain such dignity and professionalism when your own country treats you this way? How do you serve with pride when you are not given the same respect as other soldiers?" Carter paused in his demonstration of how to properly season a roast and considered the question carefully. It would have been easy to give a simple answer, to say something about duty or discipline. But these men had shown genuine interest in understanding, and they deserved an honest response. "Private Köhler," Carter said, "I serve because this is my country, with all its flaws and contradictions. I serve because I believe in the principles America claims to stand for, even when America itself fails to live up to those principles. I serve because I hope that my service, and the service of thousands of other colored soldiers, will help change minds and change policies. Change is slow, painfully slow, but it does come. And every time I do my job well, every time I prove that the color of my skin has nothing to do with my capabilities, I am helping to bring that change a little bit closer." "But does it not make you angry?" Köhler persisted. "Do you not resent serving a nation that treats you as inferior?" "Of course I am angry," Carter said, and for a moment his careful composure cracked and the depth of his emotion showed through. "I am angry every single day. I am angry when I cannot eat in the same mess hall as men I outrank. I am angry when I am called boy by white soldiers half my age. I am angry that my mother worked herself to exhaustion, serving white families who never saw her as fully human. But I cannot let that anger consume me or define me. So I channel it into doing my job so well that no one can question my competence. I channel it into maintaining my dignity, no matter how others try to strip it away. And I channel it into hope that the next generation will live in a better world than I do." The prisoners absorbed this in silence. Müller, who was also present, spoke up. "Sergeant, I want you to know that you have taught me more about true strength and character than any officer I served under in the German army. What you describe, maintaining dignity in the face of systematic injustice, requires more courage than facing enemy fire. I do not know about that, Carter said, returning to his cooking demonstration with a slight smile. But I appreciate the sentiment. Now pay attention to how I am basting this roast, because the moisture and flavor distribution is critical to the final result. As 1943 turned into 1944, life at Camp Ruston continued its rhythms. New prisoners arrived as American forces pushed forward in Europe and the Pacific. Old prisoners were sometimes transferred to other camps. Soldiers rotated in and out of assignments, but the relationships that had formed, the changes in thinking that had occurred, these things rippled outward in ways that were impossible to fully track. Private Burke put in for a transfer to a combat unit and was deployed to Europe in early 1944. Before he left, he sought out Carter one last time. "Sergeant," Burke said, standing at attention in a way that was no longer grudging but genuine, "I want to thank you for the example you set. I am going over there to fight, and I am fighting for a lot of reasons. But one of them is so that when we win this war, we can come home and build the kind of country where men like you get the respect you deserve." "I appreciate that, Private Burke," Carter said, shaking the young man's hand. "You stay safe over there. And when you come home, I hope you remember what you learned here." Burke was not the only soldier whose thinking was changed by his time at Camp Ruston. Dozens of white soldiers who had worked under Carter or observed his professionalism would carry those experiences with them for the rest of their lives. Some would become advocates for integration and civil rights in the decades to come. Others would simply treat colored people with more respect and consideration. Small changes, individual changes, but changes nonetheless. Among the German prisoners, the transformation was even more dramatic for some. Hauptmann Müller, in particular, became a vocal advocate for racial equality after the war ended. When he returned to Germany in 1946, he found a nation destroyed and forced to confront the atrocities committed in its name. Müller's experiences in Camp Ruston gave him a framework for understanding how ordinary people could accept evil ideologies when they were presented as normal and natural. Müller became a teacher in the post-war period, working to educate a new generation of Germans about the dangers of racial prejudice and totalitarian thinking. He often spoke about his time in the American prisoner of war camp, about the Negro sergeant who taught him that everything he had been taught about race was wrong. His story became part of a larger narrative of redemption and education in post-war Germany. Young Köhler, who had learned to cook from Carter, opened a restaurant in Hamburg in the 1950s. He named it Das Amerikanische Haus, the American House, and he told customers who asked that he had learned to cook from the finest chef he ever knew, a Negro sergeant in an American prisoner of war camp who showed him what true dignity looked like. Others among the prisoners carried the lessons differently. Some tried to forget, uncomfortable with the cognitive dissonance between what they had believed and what they had experienced. Some dismissed it as an aberration, an exception that proved the rule. But enough were changed that the impact could be measured, if not in statistics, then in the slow alteration of attitudes and beliefs. For Sergeant James Whitfield Carter, the war ended as it had begun, with him cooking in an army kitchen. He remained at Camp Ruston until the facility closed in 1946, after all the prisoners had been repatriated to Europe. He served a total of 7 years in the United States Army, and when he was discharged in late 1946, he returned to Birmingham, Alabama. Carter opened a restaurant in the colored section of Birmingham, a small place that seated 30 people, but developed a reputation for excellent food. White customers occasionally came, violating the social customs of the time because the food was that good. Carter ran his restaurant with the same quiet competence he had brought to his army kitchen, treating every customer with dignity and serving every meal with pride. In 1963, when Birmingham became a focal point of the civil rights movement, Carter's restaurant became an unofficial gathering place for activists. He served them food at cost or for free, using his kitchen as a small way to support the struggle for equality. When asked why he did this, given the risk of retaliation from white supremacists, he simply said that he had not maintained his dignity through years of discrimination, just to abandon it when people were finally fighting for change. Carter lived to see the Civil Rights Act of 1964 pass, lived to see segregation legally ended, lived to see at least some of the changes he had hoped for come to pass. He never spoke much about his time at Camp Ruston, considering it simply part of his service, nothing special or heroic. But to the men whose lives he touched during those years, both American soldiers and German prisoners, he represented something profound. In 1981, a group of former Camp Ruston prisoners held a reunion in Germany. Hauptmann Müller, now an elderly man but still sharp in mind, organized the event. He had spent years tracking down former prisoners and guards from the camp, wanting to reconnect with the people who had shared that strange experience of captivity in Louisiana. Through various channels, Müller learned that Carter was still alive, still running his restaurant in Birmingham. Müller wrote to him, inviting him to attend the reunion, offering to pay all his expenses. Carter, now 70 years old, was initially reluctant. His health was not perfect, the journey would be long, and he was not sure what purpose would be served by revisiting that time. But Müller persisted, and eventually Carter agreed. In the summer of 1981, Carter traveled to Germany, his first time leaving the United States since his discharge from the army. The reunion was held in a hotel in Munich, and when Carter entered the reception hall, he was greeted with a standing ovation from over 100 former prisoners, guards, and other people associated with Camp Ruston. Müller approached him, now using a cane but still tall and dignified, and embraced him. "Sergeant Carter," Müller said, his English still excellent after all these years, "thank you for coming. Thank you for everything you taught us." What followed were 3 days of conversations, reminiscences, and acknowledgements. Former prisoners spoke about how their time at Camp Ruston had changed their views on race. American soldiers, both white and colored, shared their own stories of how the camp had been a place where certain barriers began to break down. And through it all, Carter listened more than he spoke, characteristically modest about his role in any of it. On the final evening of the reunion, Müller gave a speech that brought many in the room to tears. He spoke about how easy it was to accept evil when it was presented as normal, how ordinary people could commit or condone atrocities when they were taught that certain groups were less than human. He spoke about his own complicity in such thinking and about how a Negro sergeant in a prisoner of war camp had shown him a different way through nothing more than quiet competence and unwavering dignity. "I was taught that Sergeant Carter was inferior to me because of his skin color," Müller said. "I accepted this teaching without question because everyone around me confirmed it was true. But then I saw how he worked, how he led, how he treated others with respect, even when respect was not shown to him. And I realized that I had been living in a collective delusion, a shared insanity that had led my nation to commit unspeakable crimes. Sergeant Carter did not preach to us or try to convince us we were wrong. He simply showed us, through his example, what truth looked like. And for that, I will be eternally grateful." Carter stood to respond, and the room fell silent. "I did not set out to teach anyone anything," Carter said, his voice still strong despite his age. "I was just doing my job, trying to get through each day with my dignity intact. But if my service helped some of you see past the lies you were taught, if it helped some of you recognize the humanity in people you were told were inferior, then I'm glad of that. We all carry the poison of prejudice, in different ways and to different degrees. The question is whether we have the courage to recognize it and root it out of ourselves. Some of you found that courage. I respect you for that." When Carter returned to Birmingham after the reunion, he brought with him letters from former prisoners, photographs from the event, and a plaque that had been presented to him thanking him for his service and his example. He put the plaque on the wall of his restaurant, where it remained until he finally retired in 1987 at the age of 76. James Whitfield Carter passed away in 1994 at the age of 83. His funeral was attended by family, friends, members of his church, and several people who had traveled from unexpected distances to pay their respects. Among them was Ernst Köhler, the young German prisoner who had learned to cook from Carter and who had flown from Hamburg to Birmingham to honor the man who had changed his life. In the decades since, historians have recognized Camp Ruston as an unusual place where complex dynamics of race, nationality, and humanity played out in unexpected ways. It was a place where German prisoners, who had been indoctrinated with Nazi racial ideology, found those beliefs challenged by the reality of American segregation and the competence of a Negro sergeant. It was a place where white American soldiers from the South had to confront their own prejudices when forced to acknowledge the ability and authority of colored soldiers. But at the center of all these historical forces and social dynamics was a simple truth, one that Carter lived every day but rarely spoke about. Dignity is not granted by others. It is claimed and maintained by the individual, regardless of how society tries to strip it away. Competence and character are not determined by skin color, nationality, or any other external category. And sometimes, the most powerful lessons are taught not through words, but through the steady, consistent example of a person who refuses to accept society's judgment of their worth. Sergeant James Whitfield Carter served meals to German prisoners every day for 3 years. They ate food they could not have expected, prepared by a man some of them had been taught to despise, in a country that refused him the very freedoms it claimed to defend. And in that strange convergence of contradictions, something remarkable happened. Minds changed, not all at once and not completely, but enough that ripples spread outward into the future. Carter cooked for prisoners who could not sit at lunch counters that welcomed him, the enemy, but barred him, the patriot. And by doing so with unwavering professionalism and dignity, he taught a lesson more powerful than any he could have delivered through words. He taught that the measure of a person lies not in the color of their skin or the nationality on their papers, but in how they carry themselves through the challenges life presents. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.